Dr. Stephen Greer. Now, Dr. Greer, I want to jump to a couple of, before we get to the phones, a couple of these great questions that we have in Twitter. And this one is from Ross. And Ross says, why would the people who hold the power disclose that there are tremendously more powerful people than themselves? Great question.
Well, this is actually, there's two levels to that. Number one, one of my coming to age experiences with this was at the very end of my briefing, the CIA director for Bill Clinton, and I was asking him to support bringing this information out, the technologies out, and to declassify these amazingly secret programs. And you know what he said to me? He said, well, Dr. Greer, how do we disclose that which we have no access to? We don't have access to them. We don't have control over them. So that in of itself, it was a very tearful, poignant moment. I got the sense that what president wants to admit he's the emperor that has no clothes. And on the other end of the spectrum is the fact that these people understand that they're very vulnerable to horrible things happening to them. And so there are a number of reasons why people in high places won't do it. And that's one of it. Now, the other part of it, and I think this is where you get into sort of an insecurity complex amongst folks in very covert programs, is that they realize we're dealing with civilizations that are hundreds of thousands to millions of years more advanced than we are. And those folks don't want to admit that they're not the most powerful force in the universe. So there's sort of this megalomania that goes with it, where they're trying to keep this secret. And I think that there are multiple reasons for the secrecy, and that perhaps is a significant one. Because what general or what military in the world, of course, U.S. military is the most powerful in the world, wants to say to the populace, well, we're actually, a few 100,000 years behind these civilizations that we're tracking here, and they're afraid that people will have this sort of panic over this vacuum of power. Now, I think so. There's a lot of psychological reasons for the secrecy, and then there's the ones that are a little more obvious, such as, gee, if we disclose this, and we're really the whole military-industrial financial complex is sort of hand in glove, and the intelligence community often carries the water, as it were, for the big financial interests in the world, as opposed to the interests of the United States people. And what happens when you say, yeah, these UFOs are real, and we figured out how they operate, and when they admit that, goodbye oil, gas, coal, and nuclear power, and surface roads, and internal combustion engines in your car, and jets, and almost everything we use, except some integrated circuits and fiber optics that were reverse engineered from ET vehicles, are in this black box of secrecy. But it's hundreds of trillions of dollars in these oligarchs, let's call them, the sort of the global elite power structure. Now, a lot of people say, well, isn't that justification enough for the secrecy? And I always point out, no, it is not. To enable a handful of people to amass most of the world's wealth, while half the population of the planet does not even have indoor plumbing, and millions of people are starving every day. This is not a reason. It's an excuse centered around this lust for power. And I think that's where, when people see this movie and when they read the book, which I want to emphasize really has so much more information than even the film, they're going to realize that this is not, oh gosh, are there little green men or gray men or whatever they are up there. This is a very human story about power and the future of life on our planet. And so I think many leaders really don't want to take that issue on. I mean, the former Minister of Defense for Canada, Paul Hellyer, related a story to me. I had asked him to work the Canadian government to see if there was anyone who would try to head up disclosure north of the border there. And he got back to me. He says, well, one of my people who were very junior members of my party when I was Minister of Defense is now the chairman of their equivalent of their Senate Armed Services Military Committee. And he asked him, he said, look, will you head this up? And the guy turned to Honorable Paul Hellyer and said, look, you're asking me to reel in a 2,000-pound whale, and I've got a 5-pound line.
Right,
I don't have the ability to do that.
Right.
So now most people, the average person out there would think, gee, you're chairman of a powerful G7 country's military committee. Why can't you do this? But those folks see this as such a huge undertaking, and they realize that these covert programs that have, embezzled trillions of dollars and have technologies that, as Admiral Tom Wilson said to me, you know what? I've learned that these programs have man-made flying saucers and man-made anti-gravity vehicles that can do circles around my B-2 stealth bomber. What am I going to do?
Yeah, that's exactly.
He literally said that to me and Edgar Mitchell in the E-ring of the Pentagon at the briefing. So this is something for people to think about. This is why I keep coming back to this theme that we, the people, need to do this.
Let's go to the phones. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. Dr. Greer, the politics of greed seem well embedded within this national security state, or what you have termed the transnational security superstate.
Right.
Instead of the word sociopath, I might add obscurant, part of obscure, one that opposes or tends to prevent human progress and enlightenment. It's a conscious decision. Wouldn't you agree?
Great.
Oh, sure they are, because I think that it's not just oil and money and things. It's also keeping people unaware of some basic truths, and that is that, for example, it's been known since the early 20th century when Erwin Schrödinger, who was the father of modern quantum mechanics and particle wave theory, actually, he stated the total number of minds in the universe is one. That is, it is a singularity. So it crosses into spiritual and even religious issues to come across civilizations that are not only going from one star system to another, but one galaxy to another, but are doing so with both technologies and sciences that are interfacing with consciousness and thought and crossing dimensions. So this begins to challenge not just the idea of what it means to be human, but what it means to be, period. And a lot of people would rather keep people very ignorant of the aspect of ourselves, which is a universal aspect, and which can be experienced, and many people experience in various meditative and other states. But that is part of the secrecy, because I assure you, these civilizations are not communicating across interstellar distances using an iPhone or something at the speed of a radio signal. They're using technologies that are interfacing. They are technologies, and they are a type of electronics, but they're interfacing with consciousness itself and thought itself. Now, I have to say, when I said this to the CIA director, it went right over his head, but his wife was the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences, and she got it. But see, that begins to open up another whole question about the secrecy. It's not just these macroeconomic and geopolitical issues. It also is a deeply spiritual one, because in a sense, when we look at these civilizations and how they're even communicating and how they travel, it crosses, it's where this nexus, this place comes together of mind and matter and science and technology. And this has been known for many, many decades. And by making people ignorant of this, our children in school aren't learning that what's called non-locality is a reality. Non-locality meaning that there's sort of a limitlessness of the conscious mind, but also of even particles. Einstein called this the spooky effect, where he observed that the same particle could be in two places simultaneously, and he didn't understand it. Now we really actually do understand it, this concept of non-locality.
Right.
And, okay, so, and it has to do with other dimensions and resonant fields that go beyond the speed of light. that cross over into conscious fields and consciousness and thought. And people say, wow, you're getting way out there. And I go, well, you think these civilizations are just, another version of a 747 and a radio going around? No. So if you're really going to study this issue, then you begin to uncover. It's like peeling back an onion, where there's layer after layer after layer after layer of this secrecy. And part of the deeper part of it, I agree with this caller 100%, has to do with them wanting to keep us ignorant of our own true nature, which is in itself an enormously enslaving thing to do. And I sort of call this masters and slaves, where these folks view themselves as patriarch masters, and all the rest of us are really slaves on their plantation. Now, legally, of course, we abolished slavery in the Civil War, but in reality, there is this concept amongst people who tend towards the fascist view of centralized authoritarian systems, and those can be left or right. It's not one political spectrum, but it's authoritarianism that is fascist. Those folks want to keep the plebeian masses, as they would view us, people like you and me, sort of in the dark, because we don't really deserve to know. Now, they want to know, but they don't think everyone else can handle it. It's very patronizing and insulting, and I think that in reality, most people on Earth are ready for this if it was explained and elucidated in a coherent fashion. But that would rob them not only of geopolitical and centralized political power, but these sorts of people would also realize that there would be an enormous liberation of people spiritually.
Right, and that's such a great point, too. James, you're up next.
Hi, sir. How you doing?
Doing good, James.
I just, the big question I haven't heard addressed, and I'm sure it's addressed in the book, which I'm gonna buy and read. But right now, the big question is, aren't most of these ETs and UFOs really just fallen angels and makeshift craft that have been around for millions of years? Like, according to the book Fallen Saints, The Mystery of the World Solved, they claim that these are just fallen angels. What do you say to that?
Yeah, great question, James. That comes up nearly every single day, doesn't it, Dr. Greer? The angels and gods aspect to ETs in ancient civilizations.
It does, and I think part of this is I don't think that that's literally the case so much as it is a conflation of various phenomena. And let me explain what I mean. And I know this, we live in an era where there's no nuance and everyone wants to be simplistic.
Right.
But bear me out when I explain this. There are civilizations that are interstellar, that are physical from other star systems, and those are called extraterrestrial. Now, to go from one star system to another, they are also interdimensional or transdimensional. Now, there are other intelligences that reside in other dimensions that are not extraterrestrial. And that phenomenon can also enter this dimension and present itself. Now, the problem is that because people don't have as we would say in medicine, I'm an emergency doctor, a proper differential diagnosis. In other words, a list of things that it could be to explore, they get all lumped together. And I think it's understandable. And I think in ancient times, this is why many civilizations would encounter an extraterrestrial craft and regard it as a god or an angel. And at other times, there would be other phenomena that would be mysterious that some people in the modern era of the space age attribute to aliens when it's not ET at all. It's actually another dimension altogether. So now people go, wow, this is something I've never thought of, but you better start thinking about it because it's all around us and it needs to be understood. And I think, so this is a very important question. It's great because it allows you to sort of meditate and think on this distinction. I always say, I remember I tweeted this out a couple of years ago, all interstellar capable extraterrestrial civilizations are interdimensional, but not all interdimensional beings are extraterrestrial. So, because...
Right.
Get it?
Yes,
get
yes,
it? Okay,
yes,
so
yes.
it's a nuance, but it's a very big nuance. And And I think it's important for people to realize. I remember one time I was in the emergency department early in 3-4 in the morning, and all the patients had finally left, and we had a trauma code blue in the trauma room, which is when someone dies. And we tried to resuscitate this gentleman, and he passed away. And about an hour or two later, the place was completely empty. And whatever this person was, he was so pissed off. He came into this dimension enough to turn on the EKG machine, open all the doors in the cabinets, and take the IV bags out and throw them on the floor. Now, me and the nurses watched this, and we looked at it. I knew immediately that this was an extraterrestrial. This was a human that had dropped the body and in his spirit form pushed enough into this dimension. It's like the movie Ghost.
Incredible. Let me jump in right there, Dr. Greer.
I actually saw this, and I tell people, now a lot of doctors will see things like this. They won't talk about it. They don't want to lose their medical license.
Right.
This sort of thing happens, but that doesn't mean it was extraterrestrial.
Right.
So I think, okay, it's a very, very complex multiverse out there.
But my question is to you, though. I wanted to jump in before we hit this break. When you see something like that, personally, are you now convinced of not only the other side, but certainly something interdimensional is possible?
Oh, 100%. You have to remember, I had a sighting when I was a kid, but my major contact experience when I was 18 was 6 months after. I got very sick when I was 17 and died. I had a near-death experience, and I have no question at all. Now, I was raised an atheist and taught that we didn't have a soul and blah, blah, blah. A very scientific, left-brain sort of paradigm and family. But this experience convinced me that there is a conscious body that extends beyond the physical and goes on after we pass away. And so, I began to explore and study these things when I was 17, 18. So it became very clear to me. And shortly after that, I had an extraterrestrial contact experience because they were interested in a young boy that had learned to meditate and experience this sort of cosmic part of ourselves. And I was up on this mountaintop, and I had this, 3 or 4 hour encounter. I
want to hear all of this right after the break. I want to hear it complete. So let me jump in now. We need to take a break. Our guest tonight is Dr. Stephen Greer. Before we get back to the phone calls, Stephen, I have another question from Sherry in Twitter. And she wants to know if you think that the Phoenix Lights sightings were a man-made phenomenon, or ET in origin.
Very, very good question. From what most people observe, it could be either. However, the size and the duration of that event would make me think that it was not human. And the object was a mile or two across. It was seen all the way from northern Arizona down way past in the south of Phoenix. It wasn't just in Phoenix. And there were a series of events that happened leading up to it that Dr. Lynn Katai has documented, who's a friend of mine, also a medical doctor. So it's more likely that was extraterrestrial. Now, I will say that the Hudson Valley event back in the 80s, I believe they were, where this boomerang-shaped object was seen by tens of thousands of people. People who got up close to it saw that it had seams, strut, segments. Extraterrestrial vehicles do not have that. They are seamless. The ones that are being made by Boeing Phantom Works and Lockheed Martin Skunk Works and Northrop Grumman, my uncle's old company, they are ones that would be very distinguishable if you could see that level of detail. And I always tell people that you sort of have to know what to look for because, one of the interesting things that is showcased in the movie and also in the book is where Ben Rich, the head of the super secret Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, states that, and we have this in his own writing, that there are both man-made and extraterrestrial UFOs out there. And both, and of course, we've been saying this for many years, but Michael Schratt, who's an aerospace historian researcher, was able to get these papers from a friend of Ben Rich after this person passed away, and his wife gave Michael Schratt these papers. And it's a treasure trove of documents in correspondence between this man who passed away and the head of the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. So it's a very good question that Sherry asked. And I think that in each of these events, for example, I think one of the most important cases, unfortunately, did not make it into the movie. It's in the book very extensively, that the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, a gentleman Doty referred to as the Cash Landrum crash back in the 80s outside Houston. And in that case, there were women who were irradiated and almost died from this UFO that was out of control and was being escorted by military helicopters. It turns out that this Air Force intelligence officer was the principal investigator for the Air Force and debriefed the pilots who were humans on board this craft that was a man-made propulsion system that had a nuclear power plant in it that had a filter problem and started spewing radioactivity. Now, many people for many years thought this was an ET craft that crashed. It was not. So I think what's very important is that often these classified projects want people to think something's extraterrestrial when it's really a very super secret covert aircraft of ours, of man-made manufacture or experimentation. The story is a little more complex in the Cash Landrum case because apparently the shell of the craft was from an extraterrestrial craft that we had captured. The propulsion and energy system, we couldn't get it to work properly, so we slammed this other system in it for energy, and it had a nuclear component to it that malfunctioned. Now, this is all in the book. By the way, if there are any heirs to the Cash Landrum victims, they should contact me because we have someone who represents a legal team that could now, there's enough testimony to go after the U.S. government for these horrific things that happen to civilians. And by the way, that is a very important strategy for disclosure, is people who want to come forward who have been injured or who have been abducted by human military counterintelligence operations. This is another thing that I've had dozens of witnesses tell me this, and it wasn't until this film and book that we were able to get someone to go on the record that, in fact, some of these encounters people have had that where they've been abducted and terrified were actually staged by humans to look alien but are not. And, you have to know the right questions to ask. And so I asked the questions over a 3-hour interview. And by the way, that entire interview is also something we're putting out. It's a special feature on the iTunes. It's the only place it's available except and our online store where we have just gotten it put in there, and which is at SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS Disclosure.com. But that Cash Landrum case, for many ufologists, this is an ET craft went out of control. It was not. It was a man-made or man-managed one and piloted. And the pilots were, every one of the men were people that this Air Force intelligence officer debriefed personally. And that's how he knew about it. This was not hearsay. It was firsthand.
Yeah, something definitely happened. There's no question when it comes to the Cash Landrum case, and it's just too well documented. Jesse, Durango, Colorado, you're up next.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing good, Jesse.
I was wanting to find out, in the past I've, and I still do, worked on design engineering and drafting, and most of my work's been government contracts. Which entailed a lot of classified work, but I would always work on continue working just to see about production for fuel sources and stuff. One thing I've heard that has come out is a fuel source called ODL fuel. I don't know if you've heard anything about it or not. But it's supposed to be able to go with space travel as well as vehicles, and which would probably end up making the fuel companies very upset with its abilities. But also,
yes, well, there are actually thousands of inventions and breakthroughs such as you're describing, and every one of them have been hoovered up or vacuumed up by folks who do not want them to come out.
Right.
And this is a crime against the earth and a crime against humanity. And one of the objectives, by the way, we haven't talked about today, of the film and the book, is to get that information out and try to create enough support so that we can open a research and development lab where we put these scientists in the laboratory as an open source experiment. Now, you're not going to do that with a few $100,000. You need millions of dollars. And a lot of people I'm seeing on Twitter right now, what can I do to help disclosure? I say, well, you can share it with other people. You can make contributions to what we're doing, and you can get the book and the movie, and the proceeds of that are going to go towards furthering this research. But ultimately, we really need to understand that we need to pull this out of corporate secrecy and government secrecy and even normal intellectual property secrecy and patents, and do an open source research and development project with the kinds of technologies that this woman is referring to, so that we can start a new civilization. You know, one of the mottos that we're going by is end illegal secrecy and begin a new civilization. And that's what we need to do.
Bruce, right here in Woodland Hills, California. You're up next.
Okay, am I on now?
You're on now, Bruce.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy. Hello, Dr. Greer. Great premiere. I attended it, and I was extremely impressed. And I just want to acknowledge all the people that have come forward from various government agencies, and certainly, especially yourself. These are the real heroes, because this information is so important, because our planet is in big danger, and we don't hear about this on the news. And there is technology that is literally being stolen from the people, and it has gotten in the wrong hands.
Correct.
Technology that can benefit 99+% of the people in the world for their own personal agendas, and it has to be exposed. The problem we have is, unfortunately, most people don't really understand what is going on within our government. They think, well, we got a president, a vice president, congressmen, these are our political leaders. They're not political leaders. They're nothing more than pension-seeking puppets who do nothing, and they're controlled. It's time for the people to wake up, because we are the real power to get back the truth and expose it, because
I agree. And if enough
people lead, the leaders will follow, because they're not doing the job. And it's not just this incredible technology.
If enough
There's
people
many
understood it the way you're discussing it, there would be absolutely no secrecy that could prevail. And I always tell people, if we're passive and we're sheeple, these sort of fascists are going to prevail, like they did in Germany in World War II. So I think we have to take responsibility here. And I one of the things I've always said is that after the 1990s, and I realized that the president and politicians and billionaires and all these people I had met with weren't going to touch this because it's too dangerous.
Right.
I realized that the everyday person can do it, and that the disclosure that needs to happen has to happen as a mass movement amongst ourselves, where we understand that this is not just entertainment and shock and drivel, but it's something of enormous importance to the future of our species, humans, but also to our planet and to our children. And, you know, when I always tell people, when I started this project, I was 34. I'll be 62 next month, and I have 8 grandchildren. And we need people of generations that are young, my children's age and in between to come forward and help with this. So it needs to be an activist movement of the people in order for it to succeed. I'm convinced that if the people will lead, the leaders will eventually have to follow, because they won't be able to resist it.
Thomas?
Jimmy, thank you for taking my call. Stephen, I look forward to your book and your film. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Greer, there seems to be unacknowledged projects that are reverse engineering hardware. Okay, faster than light propulsion, spacecraft, micro-miniaturization of electronics. But there's another technology, and that's biotechnology. And I was curious if you have encountered whistleblowers that are reverse engineering, back engineering, if you will, extraterrestrial and or ultra-terrestrial biotechnology genetic engineering, advanced
the answer
medical
is yes,
techniques,
and
exotic pharmaceuticals?
Okay, hold on. One at a time. Let me jump in here. Thomas, thank you for the phone call. I want to give Dr. Greer a chance to respond before the break, but great question. Is there bio back engineering going on?
Absolutely. And a lot of the so-called aliens that people see are actually what are called bio-nanotechnology forms that have been made by humans that look like aliens, but they are not. Just like some of these spacecraft look like they're ET craft, and they're not. And this is the deepest part of the secrecy. And the people I know who have worked in those laboratories and in those projects are terrified to come forward because that is a much bigger secret than even the anti-gravity and the free energy zero point and anti-gravity technologies that are material sciences. And unfortunately, you have a bunch of Dr. Strange-Lovian wackos who have access to this kind of technology, and it has been abused, and it unfortunately has been deployed. I was at a underground laboratory on the border with Mexico near El Paso some years ago, where I was invited to go. And this lab, this was in the 1990s, they had the ability to, if you had a severed arm or severed spinal column, that could be regenerated from the energetic field of what was there previously in the space-time area that your arm would have been. And these were very advanced technologies. And I asked, and I'm a medical doctor, of course, in trauma, and I've seen severed body parts like you don't want to think about. And I said, well, this would be wonderful. And they said, yes, but the same technologies that would do this could be turned into a free energy system or something else. And the powers that be don't want it out. So our medical system is actually a faint shadow of what it could be once we get these technologies and this information disclosed and developed.
Very interesting.